With us today in the primary presentation role are those folks and staff that have been working on this and are kind of our key resource people. Principal Planner David DeCordova is with us, Associate Engineer Steve Jantz, and Senior Accountant Aaron Beenan. So I'll turn it over first, I think, to Steve to go from there. Okay, thank you. David?
Thank you, Mr. Sarkozy, and good morning, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, and members of the council. How's that? A little better? Okay, thank you. Let me get this going here. Okay, sorry about that. So what I'd like to do this morning, as part of the, okay, thank you. As part of the presentation today, I wanted to start off by giving you all a overview of the general plan in general, and more particular to the city of Carlsbad, and then also give you some background on the history of our growth management program. And then I'll turn it over to Steve Jantz, and he's going to talk about our open space and parks and how we do the planning for that, how they're defined and how they're counted. Then we'll go into a section called some of the common questions that have been coming up in recent weeks and months about the parks and open space areas. And then after that, we'll turn it over to Aaron, who's going to give us some discussion about how parks and open space areas are actually funded. And then we'll wrap up with some considerations, potential questions, food for thought for the council. And then just as sort of an overview or a preview of what this presentation is intended to cover, is first point is that Carlsbad enjoys an excellent quality of life, whether it is for a provision of good quality roads, public safety services, sewer, water provision, and also open space and parks. Second point is that Carlsbad really is a leader in terms of open space and parks planning, particularly as it relates to some of our neighboring cities. And in fact, Carlsbad enjoys more than twice the amount of open space, dedicated open space in the city than some of our neighboring cities. And that is in large part due to the policies that have been put in place under the growth management program more than 25 years ago that ensure that parks and open space standards are met, and that they include funding mechanisms, and that there is regular monitoring of these facilities. And then finally, the point that we'd like to make is that the city is meeting the standards for parks and open space today, and will continue to do so under the new general plan. So what is the general plan? The general plan is a long-range policy document. It covers a period of 20 to 30 years. Every city in California is required to have one. And it is a document that really addresses the long-term health and growth of the city in keeping with community needs and desires, as well as meeting certain legal requirements. Every general plan covers a range of topics, whether it's for land use, housing, public safety, but also for open space and conservation. And the general plan really is a way of mediating among competing priorities. So For example, when you think about the various types of land uses, every community is going to be a bit different, but land use is a big component of the general plan, and excuse me. Sorry, I lost my train there. Okay. And then as far as the city's general plan, it establishes a number of goals and policies to help sort of mediate among those priorities, and that it certainly includes for open space and parks. Now, the city's general plan was last adopted in 1994, and that was the last comprehensive update to the general plan. And that was done really as a result to bring that general plan into alignment with the growth management program, which we'll talk about in a moment. There have been a number of amendments to the general plan over the years, but this is the first time that it's been comprehensively updated since 1994. So in the 1980s, California cities saw tremendous growth. And in fact, by the mid-1980s, Carlsbad was one of the fastest growing cities in the state, averaging an increase in population of 10% per year during the preceding 3 years. So in order to adequately address concerns that citizens had about the pace of growth back in the 1980s, the City Council appointed a number of citizen committees to study growth and to come up with recommendations on how to deal with that. The committees did their work in 1985, and the result were recommendations to do two things, basically. First was to reduce densities overall in the city. There was concern about the projected population at the time that Carlsbad could have over 200,000 people living in Carlsbad. So one recommendation was to reduce densities throughout the city. And then the second was to develop a public facilities plan to ensure that the growth was, or that facilities were keeping pace with the growth that was happening at the time. So the council initiated actions on those recommendations at the end of 1985. First thing that the council did was to amend the general plan land use element, reducing densities throughout the city. That was in December, and then issued a 6-month moratorium on new building permits in January 1986, and ordered city staff to develop a growth management plan. So over the first 6 months of 1986, staff developed that growth management plan and then brought it to the council in July for adoption and approval. Now, also during that time, there were a number of residents that were still concerned about the pace of growth in the city, and so there was an initiative that qualified for the ballot. That was Proposition G, that called for an annual limit to the number of housing units that would be built. The City Council at that time then took the already adopted growth management program and put that up on the ballot as well. That was Proposition E. So Proposition E was the growth management initiative that did pass by the most votes, and so that was the one that became effective. So the growth management plan that we have contains 4 major components. First is a cap on the residential dwelling units, both citywide and by quadrant. So the second major component to the growth management plan is the citywide facilities and improvements plan. And this is a framework plan that identifies the needed facilities and requires that they be provided and funded throughout the city. The third level of the growth management plan is the local facilities management plan. And then the fourth component is annual monitoring, and I'll go through each of those in a little more detail. So the first component is the residential housing cap. sorry. Couple more down. Yeah, I apologize. Okay, so the first component is the growth caps. So the citywide cap is just under 55,000, and then that number is also divided among the 4 areas of the city we call quadrants, as you can see there. So this is this number was approved by the voters in 1986, and the initiative stated that the caps cannot be increased in the future without a subsequent vote approving an increase. The next layer of the growth management program is the citywide facilities and improvements plan. And it establishes 11 public facilities, and those include city administration, so that's City Hall and other administrative facilities, wastewater treatment capacity, library, parks, drainage, circulation, fire, open space, schools, sewer collection, and water distribution. So we're going to, of course, focus on the open space and the parks facilities this morning. And the other point to this is that the facilities and standards are established by ordinance of the City Council. They can be modified as long as the purpose and intent of the modifications is maintained and that it doesn't reduce facilities. The third component to the growth management plan is the local facilities management plan, and here's where these plans get into more detail. The city is divided into 25 zones, and they follow geographic boundaries, but also intended to follow major land holdings at the time. So there was the idea was to try to organize these into contiguous logical groupings. And so a local facilities management plan is required for each zone in the city. Here's a map that just shows you the local facilities management zones. The largest one geographically there you see is Zone 1. That's in the northwest quadrant of the city. And then they are also broken up into various sizes, as I mentioned, according to some geographic and topographical considerations as well as land ownership at the time. So every local facilities management plan must contain the following. It must estimate the amount of development that will occur in that zone over time, determine what the maximum or reasonable build out is going to be for that area. It must identify a phasing approach to development in that zone. It needs to identify, quantify what facilities and how much will be needed to serve that future growth, and then provide a plan for how that's going to be provided. And then finally, it requires a financing plan that guarantees that those facilities are built. The city prepared local facilities management plans for zones 1 through 6. Those were the more established parts of town at the time. And then plans for all the other zones were prepared by landowners and developers. So we do have approved local facilities management plans for every zone in the city now. And then the fourth component is the monitoring for compliance with the city's growth management program. So new development is continuously monitored for compliance when they come forward to the Planning Commission, City Council. The first thing is to ensure that the local facilities management plan is complete and adopted, and then subsequent developments that come through the city checks to make sure that they are in compliance with the facilities management plan. If a project doesn't comply, then it won't be approved. In addition to that, the city prepares an annual report documenting how the facilities are keeping pace with new growth for all 11 facilities. And the latest report was issued for fiscal year 2012-2013. And the report concludes that the city is in compliance with all 11 facilities. If facilities are not keeping pace with development, then development will stop in that area until the deficiency is corrected. And that may be in a quadrant, or that might be in a local facilities management zone. And in fact, there was a period of time in the city's history where there was a brief stop to development because of deficiency in circulation. I believe it was at Palomar Airport Road and El Camino Real was deficient for a period of time. So the city stopped issuing permits until that deficiency was corrected. So now I want to talk about the facility standards. First one is for open space, and here's what the standard reads. And I should point out that all of the standards have both a sort of a quantifiable component to it, then also a timing component in terms of what needs to be provided, and then also by when. So for open space, the performance standard is 15% of the total land area in the local facility management zone, exclusive of environmentally constrained, non-developable land, and it must be set aside for permanent open space and must be made available concurrent with development. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but what it boils down to is that if there land within the facilities management zone, if it's otherwise developable, in other words, it's not constrained, it's not in steep slopes, it's not permanent body of water, significant wetlands, things like that, 50% of that area then must be set aside for open space. I think at this point, I'll bring up the subject of the 40%. That's a comment and concern that keeps coming up about the city's 40%. So I think I'll just touch on it here, and Steve's going to talk to it in a little more detail later in his presentation. But the 40% number was basically an estimate of what the city might have in open space at build-out, taking into consideration what was estimated at the time. Remember, we're going back to the mid-1980s. Taking into account what was constrained lands, and then also what the additional 15% open space could yield over time. So I would point out that the 40% rule was never a requirement of the growth management plan. It didn't appear in the initiative itself. It's not in the growth management program. 40% as a requirement or even as a goal didn't appear in the existing general plan. We did learn that there was a statement, I guess in the ballot argument language, there was a statement in the argument for adopting Proposition E, that by adopting Proposition E, there would guarantee that the city would remain for 40% open space statement. So that was in the argument language, but not in the ballot language itself. Okay, so the Parks Growth Management Standard, also another mouthful, but it is this. It's 3 acres of community park or special use area per 1,000 population within the park district, which is also the quadrant for the city. It must be scheduled for construction within a 5-year period or prior to construction of 1,562 dwelling units within the park district, beginning at the time the need is first identified. In the growth management program, there is no standard for proximity of parks to neighborhoods, although there are general plan policies that encourage the city to evaluate and assess proximity to housing and transportation corridors when planning for their parks, but there is no standard for having a neighborhood park within a certain distance. And then the other point is that the general plan really had a focus from 1994 going forward with satisfying much of the community's parks needs through the community parks. They're larger in size, they provide more amenities and more facilities, more variety of facilities than a lot of the special use areas. So the general plan at the time really provided a focus on serving the city's needs through community parks. Okay, so that's the overview of the growth management program. At this point, I think I'll turn it over to Steve, and he'll talk to you about open space and parks.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning, Mayor Hall, members of the council. At this part of the presentation, we're now going to get down to the nuts and bolts. Green light is on. Do you hear me? Okay. We're now going to get down to the nuts and bolts of the open space standard and the park standard as it relates to growth management. As you know, there's been an ongoing discussion in the community about what is open space, how much do we have, and how many acres are there in Carlsbad and where is it located. So what I'm going to do in the first part of my presentation is give you the facts and the technical background of our open space program. I'm going to show you a number of graphics that's going to show you the different categories, and I'm going to help define what's in each one of the different categories. But the graphics are going to show you where the open space areas are in the city. And in the second part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about the parks and what our park standard is, where our parks are, how many acres we have. And then I'm going to go through the myths and misunderstandings, and I'm going to try to address about 9 or 10 of the questions that's coming out into the public, and just let you know what the response would be. So again, there's a lot of discussion about what is open space, and you talk to different members of the community, and you have a different understanding of what it should be. Does it include parks? Does it include the natural areas? Does it include golf courses? And why do you include those things as open space? So you see, we'll come to those definitions. So we look to the general plan with the definitions of our open space categories. And right now, the general plan has 5 different categories of open space. First one being the preservation of natural resources. The second one, managed production of our resources. Outdoor recreation, both active and passive. Aesthetics, cultural, and educational open space. And the final one is public health and safety. So I'm going to show those graphically, but let me start out with number 5. Right now we have 0 acres in the 5th category, and the new general plan is not projecting that we'll have any acres in that 5th category. So I'm going to go through the first 4, and those 4 will be carried on to the general plan update. So let's start out with the first category, which is natural resources, preservation of natural resources. So again, first thing there is existing habitat preserves, as you can see on the graphic, which roughly is 4,516 acres. These include natural plant and animal habitat, as well as nature preserves, again in category number 1. Also in category number 1 are water features, such as lagoons, the strip of sand on the beaches, and Lake Calavera, which is roughly 1,310 acres. And other natural areas, which is shown here, includes wetland and riparian areas and canyons and hillsides. So you can see this is sort of the natural preserve areas, the natural habitat areas, which is all inclusive in area number 1. So you can see this is the coverage of the category number 1 citywide.
Steve, do you have acreage on that other category? Do you have acreage on the first 2 categories?
1,572 acres. Okay? Category number 2 is for the managed production of resources. So this includes a lot of our agricultural land, which is 231 acres, which includes forestry, agriculture, and aquaculture uses. The second one is for the Merkle Reservoir, which is also a managed production of our resources. That's where we have our water storage, which is approximately 88 acres. And then we have the Hub SeaWorld Research Institute right there at the Agua Hedron Lagoon, which is 7 acres. So these uses are what we identify as category number 2 in our open space. The third category is our parks, both active and passive, so outdoor recreation. So the first category is our existing parks, which is 264 acres, which do not include category number 1 acres. And I know that's a little confusing. I'm going to get to that in the myths and misunderstandings of how we apply those. Our future parks are identified, and there's 4 future parks: the Zone 5 in the Industrial Corridor, Robertson Ranch, Veterans Memorial Park, and the Cannon Lake Park. So those are our 4 future parks that are identified in our capital improvement program. And roughly, Mr. Packard, that's about 80 acres. And then we have 3 golf courses, which are recreational uses. One is the Crossings, and then La Costa and Aviara, so the 2 private golf courses, totaling 683 acres. And then we have other recreational areas, approximately 133 acres, which includes school recreational areas, campgrounds, and some greenways. So putting all those together shows you where our category 3 open space is located. And then the final one, category number 4, is for aesthetic purposes. These include a bunch of different uses, but it's roughly 543 acres. So it includes lands within the scenic, historical, or cultural value, open space that marks the entries to the city, as well as individual communities or neighborhoods in the city, green belts that separate us from surrounding communities, museums, arboreta, and botanical gardens are also included in this. To let you know, the Music Museum in NAM is not a museum, is not included in this inventory. That's a private venture. So I just want to clarify that the National Association of Making Music is not included as a museum, although it is for that purpose. So let's put these a little bit, and this is category number 5. Anyway, 0 acres, just to let you know, is not included in there. So just as a summary of our open space areas. So category number 1, roughly 7,398 acres, makes up 29.6% of our total open space in the city. The managed production resources, 362.2 acres, is approximately 1.3%. Our outdoor recreation, 1,169.4 acres, is roughly 4.7% of our open space. Aesthetic purposes are one of the smaller ones, 543.2 acres, roughly 2.1% of the city. Category number 5 is 0, for a total of, right now, today, 9,435.8 acres of general plan open space, which is roughly 37.7% of the city. That's our current inventory of our open space. That's where we are today, citywide. So a little bit less than 38% of the city is currently identified as open space. It's either general plan open space, zoning open space, or it's got a conservation easement in perpetuity over the property, so it's guaranteed to remain open space in the future. Let me tell you what's not included as open space, just to be clear. Vacant land designated for other use. So if it's a residential use, an industrial use, even though it might have a slope on the property, if it's not general plan, zoning, and or has an easement across it, those lands are not included in our open space inventory. The Coastal Rail Trail, even though it's a large trail there between Pine Avenue and Tamarack, is not included as open space. We don't include that boundary and the acreage of that trail. We do not include landscape medians, and that was one of the comments that's been coming from the public. Just to let you know, we do not include the landscape medians as our open space. And we do not include a land that's adjacent to the city for habitat preservation in the Gnatcatcher core area. So if the council's aware, in 2011, the city funded the preservation of approximately 308 acres of regional Gnatcatcher core area that is outside the city, and you see it in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. We do not include those 308 acres as our open space because it's outside the city, and through the leadership of council, you funded the preservation of that area, which is really critical habitat to the gnatcatcher for a regional perspective. So we are a partner outside of our city. This really confirms the city's commitment to the preservation of critical habitat for the endangered species. We have an adopted habitat management plan. We are the only city in North San Diego County that has an adopted habitat management plan. The plan's purpose is to protect the sensitive species that are only here in Southern California. It's a 50-year plan, and with our contribution to the regional Gnatcatcher Corps, we have met 90% of our goal in the first 10 years of that 50-year plan. So we are ahead of the curve with regard to our projection for the 50-year plan. So that, I think, hopefully brings us up to speed, facts where we are, what our open space acreage is, where it's applied to the city, how we use the definitions in the general plan to determine those. Staff spent a lot of time with our GIS staff, planning, program environmental management, to actually drill down to the parcel level to identify those open space areas. And again, I want to emphasize, we were able to verify those through maps, through general plan, and other documents that can confirm that these areas actually do comply with our city's open space definitions in our general plan. At this point, I'm going to go through the myths and sort of the misunderstandings. I'm going to answer some of the questions, ask those questions, and answer those questions that we've heard from the public, either through the emails, through the public review process in our general plan update, or we've heard through just contact with members of the community. I'm going to separate the two issues. I'm going to talk about open space first, and then I'm going to talk about parks second. And there's a reason why we need to separate those, because in interpretation, some of the comments we see in the public seem to overlap the two, and from growth management, they are two separate performance standards, and they really need to be evaluated separately. So I'm going to start with open space and go through those, and then I'm going to go through the parks, because they need to be addressed separately. So the first one is, where did the 40% number come from, and how was it developed? So as Dave mentioned, when the inception of growth management, there was an estimate that was provided in the general plan that basically determined that the city already had 25% citywide open space as defined by the general plan. So we started with that base. We assumed and we estimated that 25% was already at open space. Under growth management, there was an addition of another 15% open space on the remaining developable land to be set aside as open space. However, when you get down to the nuts and bolts of that 15%, it's basically 15% of undeveloped areas for those zones that were not in compliance with our current open place standard. So maybe this graphic will show a little bit better. In the citywide facilities and improvement plan, out of the 25 zones, 11 of those zones were already determined to be in compliance with the open space standard. There was already 15% open space in the zone, and or there were zones that were infill, they were built out, and we weren't sure that we were going to get the 15% because there was no future development in that LFMZ. So when you look at it from a citywide perspective, 11 out of the 25 zones were already in compliance, which means the remaining 14 zones were where we're going to see an increase in our 15% open space requirement. So the perception is that we were going to receive 15% citywide through growth management, and unfortunately the workings do not allow that. The math would not work that way because a little bit less than 50% of the zones had already been in compliance, so we're only getting the remaining 15% open space from the remaining 14% zones. So the 25 and 15 is a good rule of thumb to show that we were going to get 40%, but the workings show that we may not get to that 40%. Right now, projections show that we might get a little bit less than 39 if we look at our future development. But keep in mind, we're looking at build-out. Build-out is 2035. As the city continues to develop, there may be other opportunities there, and we're working towards the 40%. But if we look at what we know today, we may be a tad bit short, about 1% short citywide. And that's really due to the workings of that 15% in growth management. So just I want to clarify that with you, that when you look at that 15, there's actually a reason why in numbers below it that we may not receive, we may not realize that 15% citywide. Does the city double count HMP and parks acres as in the open space inventory? And we do not. So remember when I was, there was I mentioned earlier that how we look at the HMP and our open space areas and the 5 different categories. And we have 5 parks that have the HMP land that's within the boundary of that park. And so when we look at how we compute our inventory of open space, the park area, so the recreational grass area, buildings and parking lot, is included in category number 3. But the HMP acres within those 5-acre parks are included in category number 1. So we do not double count the 2 areas as one. We do separate them in our inventory because they're different categories, and so we keep them clear. So using GIS, we parceled out the park and we parceled out the HMP area and provided in their own category. So we do not double count parks and HMP as in our open space inventory. Does the general plan update reduce the amount of open space conserved? The bold answer is no, it does not. The city will actually have more open space in the future than we do today, and the general plan update includes policies for habitat preservation. Staff is not proposing that we are going to change any of the standards in our open space elements in our general plan. We're still going to be pursuing future open space per growth management, the 15% for those zones that are required to do so. And so with those actions, we will actually see an increase in our open space inventory between now and build out. So there will be no reduction, and there are no policies in the general plan that's going to propose to reduce and or stop our collection of open space. So now I'm going to delve into the park section. And I'm going to put aside the open space for now. I'm going to deal with the parks. So I'm closing that book, and let's open the growth management book on parks. So this chart shows where we are today and where we're projecting as far as our park acreage. And I apologize, it's a little bit hard to read, but you see the left part of the column shows our existing acres per quadrant. And again, the park standard is based on quadrant compliance. Showing the future acres that we're aware of in those quadrants with a total. And the park performance standard is population-based. 3 acres per 1,000 population. So looking at the build-out population of the city, which is projected at 131,152, applying that to the acres that are needed per the different quadrant, we show that actually at build-out will be in excess of parks by about 50 acres. So I want to answer the question, will the city be short of city parks at build-out? Bold answer again is no. We're projecting that we'll actually exceed our park performance standard for growth management by 50 acres at build-out. So since there was a lot of discussion about our parks, there's a lot of community concern and a lot of discussion about our parks, we just want to try to look at our park coverage. So we looked at the National Recreation and Park Association, let's say, guidance to how far a coverage area should be for the various different type of parks. So typically they're a 1/4 of an acre for mini parks, a 1/2 an acre for neighborhood parks, a 1/4 mile for mini parks, a 1/2 mile for neighborhood parks, and anywhere from 1 to 3 miles from community parks. So we're using that guidance, and we're hoping to graphically show you the coverage of the city with our current and future parks. So this map shows our existing parks in 1986, and if we apply those 2 1/4 mile and 1/2 mile radius around each one of those parks, this was the park coverage in 1986. Since that time, we built a number of parks throughout the city, and if we apply the same radius around each one, you see we have a little bit more of a coverage of the city in our parks. We have the future parks, so Veterans Memorial, Zone 5 Park, Robertson Ranch, and Cannon Lake. And we apply the coverage around those in the future. And then we have all our private recreation. So these include some of the mini parks, pocket parks, other recreational areas around the city, the smaller ones. We still apply those, and if you look at it from a citywide perspective, we have a pretty good coverage of the city. Now, there's a lot of colors on this graphic, just to sort of help you out. The yellow, light yellow colors, those are the areas that are residential land uses that are currently maybe outside of those quarter mile and half mile radius. The pink area in the middle is the industrial corridor. And so this generally shows that we are, and actually, and then the areas off to the right, I'm a little bit sort of the grayer areas, those are our open space areas, which there will be no development potential in the future. So this sort of shows the general coverage of the city using the quarter mile and the half mile radius. I did mention in the beginning of this that for community parks, it's anywhere from 1 to 3 miles. We did not apply that radius on this map. It's still somewhat subjective, but we did not apply that. If we did, we would probably see a lot of those open areas would be covered by the current and future parks in the city. So what's not included in our park acreage? Well, we do not include the beaches. We do not include the ocean area, which is a recreational amenity. We do not include the Lake Calaveras Preserve, which is 260 acres with roughly 6.5 miles of trails that is used by a lot of people. But that's not included in our parks inventory. We don't include the private parks and master plan communities. We don't include the recreational area on the eastern basin of the Agua Hedron Lagoon, which the city has a lease, and we currently operate and manage all the uses in that lagoon. We do not include the Crossings Golf Course as a park. And we do not include Hub Park lease area, which is right there on the north side of Cannon Road. So again, our inventory 37.7%, but we do not include these areas in our parks inventory. They're open space areas, they're, in category number 1 or category number 3, but we do not include them in our park inventory, even though they do provide recreational amenities. Another question, does the city count school grounds as park acreages? And yes, we do. We actually have a joint use agreement with all 3 of the school districts, and we have identified in that joint use agreement 8 schools that the city is able to program recreational uses outside of school hours. So Aviara Oaks, Buena Vista Elementary, Carlsbad High, Jefferson Elementary, La Costa Meadows, Levante, Magnolia, and Valley Junior High School. The joint use agreements allow the city to use the various facilities that are identified in the joint use agreement. So again, we use GIS technology, we drill down on the school sites, we only capture the area of the fields or the tennis courts that we are allowed to program. We do not include the rest of the school, we do not include the buildings, we do not include the parking lots, we don't include the football field at Carlsbad High School. We only include the fields that we are allowed to program for recreational uses. So we do count school grounds, but only those areas that are under the joint use agreement. So again, does the city count school grounds as park acreage? We only count the fields and courts. Right now, it makes up about 10% of our park acres. And we are working with CUSD, the Carlsbad Unified School District, on an updated agreement. There are 2 parks that we're having discussion, 2 schools that we're having discussions with the Carlsbad Unified School District. And if we can come up to an agreement, we will bring that joint use agreement to the city council that could add more acreages for usage. So the perception is the public goes to the school grounds and they're locked. Well, any of those schools that are outside of those 8, they are locked during school hours, they're locked during evenings, they're locked during nighttime, during weekends. Those 8 schools that I showed, these are actually available for after school hours, so 3 o'clock till 9 o'clock, till the evening. They are allowed on weekends, but they are not allowed during school hours. So when school's in session, these fields are locked. They're only open when school is out. And we all can understand safety of our school children, and they don't want people there using their fields. So again, it's allowed to be used after school hours. Does the city count preserve acres as part of the total acreage of certain parks? Again, I mentioned back in our open space discussion, we do have category 3, category 1 parks. So category 3, category 1 for the parks, but for open space. But in our park discussions, we open that park book. Yes, we do count the preserve area as part of the park boundary. So we're dealing with parks. The open space areas to those 5 parks, Poinsettia, Leo Carrillo, La Costa Canyon, and Hidden Canyon, and the future Veterans Memorial Park do have hardline habitat that's right along the boundary, included in the boundary of the park property. But for park purposes and park acreage purposes, we include the full boundary of the park, which includes HMP area and the recreational uses in the park, but limited to only these 5 parks within the city's park system. This is a common practice in the industry, that you do include the full boundary of the parkland and what it includes in it as the park inventory. And so we've taken that full boundary and put that acreages in our park inventory for our city's park system. Does the city apportion future Veterans Memorial Park to all 4 quadrants? And yes, we do. And we've been doing that since 1986. Veterans Memorial has been identified as a special resource area, will have citywide and regional significance. It was considered back in doing all the research, it was considered as a centrally located park accessible to all the citizens in an entire community. It's a 90-acre community park, and it's been apportioned to all 4 park quadrants. So 22.5 acres has been apportioned for growth management purposes to all 4 parks, our park quadrants. And the methodology was adopted with the 1986 Citywide Facilities Improvement Plan. So, as Dave mentioned, in September of 1986, when the City Council adopted the Growth Management Plan, the Citywide Facilities Improvement Plan, the funding mechanism, and so on, in those documents was the identification of Veterans Memorial Park, then I think it was called Macario Canyon Park, and that the decision was made that it would be apportioned to all 4 quadrants due to its size, central location, and that it would serve the community as a whole. So let's step out a little bit and just say, how does Carlsbad compare? We have more than twice as much designated open space as our neighboring cities. Again, we're the only city in North County with an adopted habitat management plan, and it more than doubly conserves acres per 1,000 population of any of our neighboring cities. So I'm going to show a couple charts real quick. So looking at 37.7% of the city is currently open space, we are the leader in amount of acres of open space citywide than our neighbors. Even if we break it down and look at it from a population perspective, so how many acres per 1,000 population, Carlsbad has 53.42 acres of dedicated conserved land per population, which shows again we're more than double of our neighboring cities with regard to our open space. So really, in summary, protection of open space has been a high priority of the city, and also it's been a high priority of the city council. City has more open space than any of our neighboring cities, twice as much in some cases. The only city in the North County with a habitat management plan, and we have funding mechanisms in place that guarantees the construction of parks and funding in place to have an opportunity, if open space becomes available, to acquire that open space and add to our open space inventory. That completes my segment. I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Beenan, who's going to talk a little more about the financing of our parks and our open space systems.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, Mayor, members of the council. I'll briefly talk about some of the financing we've used to date to finance parks and open space, and also what some of the options are going forward. A variety of financing methods have been used to date. In most methods, the philosophy was pay-go, that growth paid for the impacts of growth. Pay-go was implemented via special taxes, developer impact fees or direct contributions, and or general taxpayer monies. Many park projects have been funded via this pay-go philosophy, including the Alga Norte and Aviara community parks. In a couple unique cases, notably the golf course and Haas Grove, the city felt that it would be most prudent to use debt financing in those instances. Despite the existing financing mechanisms available, there are still approximately $19 million in existing unfunded park projects, including Pine Avenue, Madison Property Phase 2, and Robertson Ranch Parks. Financing future parks and open space can be done similarly to how we have historically financed parks and open space. However, each option available has challenges. For example, creating a new or redoing an existing impact fee creates an equity issue because approximately 80% of the estimated residential and approximately 67% of the estimated commercial industrial development has already occurred. Debt financing could also be considered, but that moves away from the city's historical pay-go philosophy. A ballot measure could be used to preserve the pay-go philosophy. However, there are already various projects competing for general fund resources. One example is the coastal corridor. And additionally, adding more parks and open space will change the financial matrix of the city. It will affect the city's estimated revenues and/or expenditures. For example, if we have a planned future commercial site that is rezoned to be a park, the city forgoes the additional property tax and sales tax revenue and incurs additional ongoing operating expenses. These are some of the challenges to financing future parks and open space. And now I will turn it back over to David.
Thank you. Okay, I'd just like to wrap up with a few concluding comments and then some questions or considerations. So, have these policies worked? We think they have. The growth management standards have been met throughout the period of time since 1986. They're being met today and will continue to do so in the future. We will have more dedicated open space, not less, going forward. And the public approves of the approach that the city has taken, and this is evidenced by the annual resident satisfaction survey that the city does. 96% are satisfied with their quality of life in Carlsbad. 95% agree that Carlsbad promotes access to active lifestyle, parks, and open space. 81% agree that Carlsbad protects and enhances open space and the natural environment. And 92% are satisfied with the city's efforts to provide recreational trails. And then finally, as Aaron mentioned, new growth pays its way. So the growth management program ensured that the impact of new growth on facilities are borne by the new development and not existing residents. So finally, just to kind of wrap up and conclude, just some considerations for this morning's purposes. Are the standards meeting the quality of life goals? Is there a need to reevaluate what those standards are? And is a change in approach warranted? And then finally, if additional parks and open space are desired, how will they be funded and what are the trade-offs? So that concludes our presentation.